So here's our third part in the coral reef video lecture. We left off last part talking about different types of reefs. So we have the fringing reef, which right along the shoreline, basically connected to the actual shoreline. The barrier reef in structure is very, very similar to the fringing reef, but much further out from the shoreline. There's that big lagoon that separates the barrier reef from the shoreline. In some cases, that lagoon might be 60 miles wide. So structurally very similar, but way out, off the shoreline. And then the third type of reef structure we were talking about, and we left off with, were the atolls. Now, atolls are found kind of out in the middle of nowhere. You find an atoll in the middle of the ocean, and question, how the heck did this form? Because it has to have, in order for reefs to form, they have to have relatively shallow water. And we're talking 100, 150 feet of water in order for corals to grow and build up and build up and build up. So atolls were a mystery. Charles Darwin first proposed the idea of atoll formation back in the 1800s. By and large, nobody believed him, kind of got ignored, but then in the 1900s, people finally figured it out and went, oh, Darwin was right. Okay, so here's how an atoll forms when we look at atoll formation. Atolls start out forming from a volcanic island. Alright, so a volcanic island forms in the ocean. Ocean volcanoes are created or push magma up, creating an island. So this volcanic island forms, and from this volcanic island, a fringe reef forms around the volcanic island. So you got your volcano, and then you have your, let me get the pen, and then you have your fringe reef starting to form. Alright, so here's the volcanic island. That would be the volcano, little magma chamber, pushes up. That's why we get the island. And then you get the fringe reef starting to form on the perimeter of the volcanic island. So it gives you, in a sense, a ring of reef around the volcanic island. But then weathering erodes the island. And that island slowly disappears below the water. Alright, so as the island disappears and it keeps sinking, the lagoon starts to form, but you still have this fringing reef. Now, when you get this lagoon formation, then we're going to switch over and start calling it more of a barrier reef here. Okay, so here's our lagoon. Let me go to blue. The lagoon forming around the volcanic island as that island gets smaller and smaller due to weathering and sinking. And then the reef that is sitting on the outside here, that's going to be now started, we classify that as a barrier reef because it's got the lagoon that separates the reef from the island. And then that island continues to sink. Eventually the island could completely submerge and disappear. And now we have this outer band of coral surrounding the lagoon. And there is your atoll. Alright, so the atoll is a collection of these outer little reef patches of reef. Sometimes there's little keys, these little islands that build up sand and accumulate enough to create a little key. But if you dig down deep enough, you're going to still find that original island, that original volcanic island. And that's what researchers did when they drilled in the Marshall Islands. They drilled down and they went to an atoll and drilled down through the atoll, and eventually you hit volcanic rock. So now we know how atolls form. The mystery has been solved. Alright, so we got three types of reef structures we want to keep in mind. So, alright, so again, general coral reef ecology. Tropical water is low in nutrients. These are just key things I want you guys to remember and make sure you're comfortable with. Low in phytoplankton or productivity, and low in primary productivity. And because of the lack of nutrients, phytoplankton, and primary productivity, corals provide protection, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and phosphates for the zooxanthellae. Alright, and in turn, zooxanthellae provide food, oxygen, and help produce the calcium carbonate skeleton for the corals. Alright, so all this is the basis of our reef ecosystem. So when we look at a reef and you go, wow, again, Caribbean, it's this beautiful, clear, tropical waters. It's because there's not much phytoplankton and primary productivity or nutrients there. But what it does, though, is it does set up the typical coral reef food web. So food webs are the greater connection between all of the organisms in a community. Food webs always start at the producer base. Now, the producer for most of the reef will be these. Anything photosynthetic, seaweed, algae, diatoms, dinoflagellates, all those things we talked about that are photosynthetic, those are going to be part of the producer base. We can argue corals also are part of the producer base because of the zooxanthellae. In particular, we'd say the zooxanthellae. Then that energy flows up to the consumers. Now, I want you guys to write it out. Write down or remember what is the rule, how much energy flows from a producer to the first level consumer, and then how much would go to the second level consumer, and so on and so forth. The different relationships we see within the coral reef ecosystem and the food web are things like herbivory. You're going to have your grazers, different species of fish, urchins, snails, chitons, etc. You're going to have your plankton feeders that feed upon the plankton. Again, some of those fish, sea fans, sea stars, whale sharks, those guys are actually plankton feeders. And then our direct predators, guys that eat the meat, different corals, because they're grabbing food out of the water column. We have different fish, sea stars, etc. that fall into that category. And then the detritus feeders. These are things that basically filter out all the detritus, the food, the broken down organic matter. Things like sea cucumbers, certain corals, certain invertebrates, etc. feed on the detritus. And then all that energy eventually can flow up to the top level predators, the sharks and different species of fish like barracudas and tunas and etc., as well as squids and octopuses, some of the mollusks, etc. But that's the connection in the food web. In the previous lectures, we talked about food chains. Well, now we're building the food web. So I want us to start thinking about big picture. What happens if this population down here goes up? Is that a good thing? Increase in the seaweed population. How does that benefit the diadema? If the diadema goes up, does that benefit things above it in the food chain? But does that disrupt other things within the food web? So there's huge amounts of connections that we want to try to get more comfortable with as we explore the marine ecosystem with the food chains and the food webs. But corals are, a pretty important part of the reef. And when we look at corals, there's quite a few things that actually feed directly on the corals. They might eat the mucus that's produced by the corals. They might eat eggs of the corals, the little planula produced by the corals, the larva, the coral itself. So there's all sorts of things out there that are eating corals. And you guys scratch your head and wonder, good Lord, how do corals manage to survive and maintain their growth and stability? It's just part of the reef ecosystem. So all these animals pictured here, damselfish, butterfly fish, parrotfish, worms, wrasses, shrimp, urchins, etc., all these things feed upon corals. So there's a lot of predation on corals. So in the reef, we also want to look at how competition influences reef structure. So competition is for space and light on the reef. Alright, it's not just for food, but space. Do I have room to grow? Do I have space? And can I get light? So corals often fight each other for that space and for that light. You know, they will send out those mesenteral filaments and sting each other to death in an attempt to kill each other so they get more space. So this yellow line I just drew down here, this is showing us two different species of coral that are fighting for space. Once you get the space, you tend then to be able to have more of the light access. So there's a lot of competition. Different reef inhabitants deter predation by producing different chemicals, different toxins. We're using those in the medical world and learning how valuable those things are for humans. But there's a lot of competition on the reef, so big feature we want to keep in mind. And lastly, when we talk about reef ecosystem, we talk about coral predation, coral grazers, things like that. A lot of the predation come from the fish, the butterfly fish, and sea stars. Those are the main primary predators of corals. So we're going to look for these. I want you guys to get familiar with some examples of different types of fish. Think about the fish body plan. So down below here we have this butterfly fish, this banded butterfly fish. These guys are major predators on corals. So you see them swimming around. They're really neat looking. There's a bunch of varieties of butterfly fish. But watch, they're going to go and you'll see them nipping away at corals. So they're not the nicest to fish when it comes to being a coral. When we talk about grazers, make sure I spell butterfly correct. Alright, there we go. When we talk about grazers, there's a variety of different fish that are grazers. They consume algae. And the urchins, these guys are incredibly important in controlling seaweed. So those are the types of fish and animals that we really, really like the diadema. They're grazers. They eat the algae. They eat the seaweed. So they allow the corals the opportunity to grow, to reproduce, to expand their colonies. So if we got rid of diademas, our reef ecosystem starts overgrowing with algae. Sadly, this occurred in Jamaica. It's not really a healthy coral reef anymore. It's basically a big reef of algae there. That's why you see a lot of ecotourism shifting away from Jamaica simply because of the lack of healthy and diverse reefs. So we've gone through coral reefs, looked at the basic ecology, basic features, structures of different types of reefs. We want to make sure we're comfortable with that, so when we're seeing it, when we're snorkeling in it or diving in it, we have a better feel for what we're actually seeing. Hopefully a greater appreciation for the diversity of the coral reef ecosystem.